Well, good morning, and welcome to the 16th annual Georgia Writers Hall of Fame ceremony. I'm Toby Graham. I'm the University Librarian and Associate Provost here at the University of Georgia, and today we gather to celebrate the lives and the works of James C. Cobb, Alfred Corn, Kevin Young, and posthumously of Eugenia Price. They're among the 61 writers inducted since the University of Georgia established the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame in 2000. The Harvard Rare Book and Manuscript Library, which administers the Hall of Fame, holds the most extensive collection of works written by Georgians and about Georgia, and the papers of many of our state's great literary figures. I need to express our deep gratitude to the late George Montgomery and to Nancy Montgomery, whose love of literature and whose philanthropic spirit led them to create a Georgia Writers Hall of Fame endowment to ensure that we're able to recognize the literary talent of Georgians for years to come. President Jerry W. Moorhead, we are grateful for your presence with us today. We thank you for your leadership in what is, I think, an extraordinary period for the University of Georgia. I do want to mention that President Moorhead is not only our president, but also a professor, and so he will be leaving in a little bit to teach a first-year Odyssey class, but we're glad that you're able to spend some time with us here this morning. I welcome all of our previously installed Georgia Writers Hall of Fame inductees. Some of them I will acknowledge individually with the panel of judges, but I also see with us Jane Kilgo, representing Jim Kilgo, an inductee into the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame. Thank you so much for being with us today. I saw Susan Percy come in. Where are you, Susan? Susan, wave your hand a little bit. Well, there we go. And Susan is with Georgia Trend magazine, but also here representing her late husband, Paul Hemphill. We have Judson Mitchum. Judson, where are you, sir? Judson. Judson is the poet laureate of the state of Georgia and one of our inductees. Do we have any other inductees who I missed? Okay, we are so glad to have you on. Well, Taylor, we're going to get you in a second, buddy, because we're going to talk about the Board of Judges. Okay, we'll get there. All right, and we're glad to have you here, sir. Thank you. So I'd like to thank our library staff, including Skip Hewlett, Leandra Nessel, Chantel Dunham, Gene Cleveland, Christian Lopez doing the videography back there. The Georgia Writers Hall of Fame relies on a distinguished panel of judges to determine which authors are inducted, and I'm going to take a moment to recognize them. So please stand as I call your name to the Board of Judges. So we have Lisa Baer. Lisa is the director of the University of Georgia Press. Roy Blunt Jr., who's not able to be with us, he's a 2016 inductee of the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame. Taylor Branch, who is a 2015 inductee into the Writers Hall. We have Dr. Stephen Corey, editor of the Georgia Review. Stephen, thank you. Peggy Gallus of Athens, Georgia. Peggy. We have a new member joining our panel of judges this year, the CEO of the Atlanta History Center, Sheffield Hale. Where are you, Sheffield? Welcome. We appreciate you joining the board, and it's great to have you here with us. Okay, so we have Dr. John Insko, the Albert Say Professor of History at the University of Georgia. Dr. Insko. Julie Hunt from Tifton, Georgia. Nice to see you, Julie. Thank you. Shell Knox, who I don't believe is with us today. Dr. John Lowe, the Barbara Methvin Lester Distinguished Professor of English. Dr. Lowe, thank you. Dr. Barbara McGaskill, Professor of English here at UGA, and Janice Ray, 2015 inductee. And they're not with us today, I don't believe. There's Dr. We do have. Barbara's here. I thought you weren't going to be able to make it, Barbara. Professor Barbara McGaskill, please stand up. Thank you. Wonderful to see you. Dr. Hugh Rupersberg, Emeritus University Professor of English and Senior Associate Dean. Bill Shipp, who was inducted in 2016, who I'm sure would love to be here if he could. Lisa White from Savannah. Was she able to make it in time for this? Okay. Neely Young. And Neely is retired now, but he's the longtime publisher and editor-chief of Georgia Trend magazine, a wonderful fixture in our state. And then Dr. Jamil Zinaldine, the president of Georgia Humanities. And finally, just a very warm welcome to the family and the friends of our inductees. We are so glad that you are with us here at the Russell Building, the home to our special collections libraries. And now I'd like to welcome to the podium Dr. John Insko, who will help us to induct James C. Cobb into the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame. I introduced John a moment ago as Professor of History at UGA, and I will just add that he also is the founding editor of the New Georgia Encyclopedia. So, Dr. Insko, please.
Thank you, Toby. Good morning, all. It's with great pleasure and pride that I introduce my longtime friend and colleague, James C. Cobb, as the first of today's inductees into the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame. Though he retired this past year after 19 years as the B. Fennessy Spalding Distinguished Professor of History at UGA, Jim Cobb remains the most eminent and most versatile scholar writing on the American South today. His 12 books and over 40 articles and essays include some of the richest and most insightful treatments of the region's economic, political, social, cultural, and literary past, and have established him as not only one of the most respected historians currently working in the field, but also one of the most visible of the university's public intellectuals, with commentary that reaches not only regional, but often national and international audiences on a regular basis. Jim is a native of Hart County, where he grew up on what he describes as a 1-acre dirt farm. We're going to hear more about that from him. He's a triple dog, having earned not both, but all three of his degrees, BA, MA, and PhD here at Georgia. The latter received in 1975. After wending his way through much of the SEC, holding ever more prestigious positions at Ole Miss, at Alabama, and Tennessee, Cobb was lured home to UGA in 1997, and we've kept him here ever since. Incidentally, Jim is, by my calculation, only the second academically based historian to be inducted into our Writers Hall of Fame, the other being W.E.B. Du Bois. In good company. We also have two wonderful independent historians already part of the Hall of Fame, Taylor Branch and Melissa Fay Green. Again, good company to be. I'll only make brief mention of Cobb's many books, or you'd be listening to me all morning. He made a splash with the first of his two books, The Selling of the South in 1982 and Industrialization in Southern Society, a mere 2 years later. With them, he established himself as an innovative new interpreter of the region's economic history, even as he began to cast the region in a far more holistic and comparative framework, a hallmark of much of his subsequent work on the South. That multifaceted approach to regional identity came to full fruition with Cobb's next monograph, The Most Southern Place on Earth, in 1992, a brilliant micro-history of the Mississippi Delta, in which he portrayed as a land of extremes, of climate, disease, and floods, of caste, wealth, and power, through which he sought to, quote, untangle the enigma of this grindingly poor but prolifically creative region. It quickly became the model for studying other regional cultures and subcultures. Hugh City of Time magazine stated that, quote, no other author knows that history so well and puts it down fact by anguished fact in such compelling fashion. Anyone who wants to find the soul of this civilization needs to read what Jim Cobb has written. Even more influential was a remarkably full-bodied study of Southern identity, Way Down South, published in 2005. The book that sealed Cobb's reputation as the region's preeminent interpreter. Anthony Badger of Cambridge called it a tour de force from one of the South's premier historians, who, with characteristic wit and acuity, shows how that identity from the time of Jamestown to the Iraq War depended not just on how white and black Southerners thought of themselves, but also what others thought of them. John Shelton Reed of UNC Chapel Hill, himself one of our leading Southernologists, hailed Way Down South as a masterpiece, calling it a comprehensive, thoughtful, and utterly fascinating account in which Cobb stalks the elusive mind, or rather minds, of the South. Yet another front on which Cobb made an early and indelible mark was in placing the South on a world stage. Building on his first book's focus on Southern efforts to lure international firms to the region, Cobb enlarged on those themes when he and a colleague organized a major symposium here at UGA on the globalized South, which Cobb contributed to the keynote address, which became the lead essay in an anthology of conference presentations published in 2005 as Globalization in the American South. Cobb was mighty busy in 2005. Finally, it's important to note how fully Cobb has long engaged with far more than his academic peers. His very popular and engaging brief history of his home state, Georgia Odyssey, first published by UGA Press in 1997 and updated in 2008, remains the most widely read of multiple state histories in circulation these days, and is found as receptive an audience among general readers as it has with students and scholars. He has long found outlets in the mainstream media for probing and often provocative commentary in which he provides historic context on a range of current issues, debates, and controversies. These include the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Los Angeles Times, London's Times Literary Supplement, Financial Times, and NPR. Through all of these venues, including his own blog, Jim pulls no punches, never hesitating to take honest and often unpopular stances on a host of issues, from the state flag battles in Georgia, Mississippi, and Alabama, to legislative tampering with public school history curricula, to Georgia's closing of its state archives a few years back as a budget-saving measure, which was ultimately overturned by a public outcry at which Cobb was front and center. This summer, he took on the Confederate monuments issue with a piece called Confederates in Concrete on the Move. And in a prime example of his self-effacing wit, which I'm sure we'll see on exhibit momentarily, Jim wrote his follow-up piece on the not-so-popular reaction to his views. He used a quote from one of those responding as the title of his column, calling it, "Apparently this guy actually wrote a book about the South." Imagine the poor sods who ended up reading it. Cobb can take comfort from real accolades that, of course, far outnumber such dubious judgments. In addition to multiple awards for his publications, one other is worthy of mention. In 1997, he became one of the youngest historians ever to serve as president of the Southern Historical Association in its 80-year history, an honor usually bestowed toward the end of one's career, not mid-career, as was the case with Cobb. The nation's third largest historical organization, with over 5,000 members at the time, Cobb delivered one of the most memorable and meaningful presidential addresses in 1999. Entitled An Epitaph for the North, he offered a partly tongue-in-cheek and partly profound, and all vintage Cobb, reconsideration of national and regional identity formation, making the most convincing case that for better or worse, it's been the South, far more than the North, that has driven much of what has become the national political and social values over the past half-century. Appreciation of Cobb's achievements have been expressed by a vast array of distinguished admirers, from Gavin Wright of Stanford University, who called him his generation's leading interpreter of the South, to novelist Terry Kay, who noted that no historian of my reading has succeeded in reporting the telltale events and moods of the American South as well as Jim Cobb. All historians inform, Jim Cobb reveals. Perhaps the most apt characterization of what makes Cobb so special came from John Bowles, the longtime editor of the Journal of Southern History, who in 1996 offered the following assessment that still holds true 2 decades later. He is clearly very bright, is extremely hardworking, has superb interpretive skills and sees interesting connections between events, ideas, and people across time and place, Bowles wrote. He's filled with enthusiasm about his subject, but has not a trace of intellectual arrogance. His wit, humor, and evident desire to know the past and communicate what he knows makes him a captivating speaker, writer, and teacher. Cobb's current book project is a much anticipated biography of C. Vann Woodward. Woodward is the most influential and prolific historian of the South of his generation, and it's very fitting that his biographer is, by all accounts, a most worthy successor to that title. Again, I am proud to present to you one of our university's and our state's most valuable resources, Jim Cobb.
And we will have for Jim and all of our inductees a special book-like plaque suitable for display with your likeness and a logo for the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame. I'll give it back to you later.
I'd been saying it was too late for him to back out now, but I'm not so sure if Toby starts edging for the door with that plaque. Nervous. Thank you, John Isco. By all rights, it should be you up here thanking me for all the great things I just said about you. As it stands, I am honored all the more to hear such generous words from someone I so love and admire, and who surely qualifies as one of the very best people on the entire planet. I can't possibly begin to acknowledge the presence today of so many people who have meant so much to me over the years, but I have to offer my very special shout out to the many former classmates and friends from Hart County who have made it here today from all over, especially the Hardy Bunch who procured a van and arrived, as we so frequently say up in Hart County, en masse. I deeply regret that our beloved coach Bill Say, who was planning to be here, suffered a broken hip on Thursday. We all pray for his speedy recovery. Mindful of William Faulkner's observation that it is himself that every Southerner writes about, and looking to acquaint you with the people, the place, and the circumstances that largely made me who I am, allow me to begin with a story. And this won't be the first time some of you have heard this story, but who cares? In the deceptively delicate vernacular of Hart County, Georgia, my mother's cousin, Thaman Hicks, was often referred to as bad to drink. This as opposed to merely a common run-of-the-mill drunk, of whom it might be said with appropriate scorn, I never knew he drank till I saw him sober. The former and decidedly less disparaging designation was meant to indicate that the person in question had at least some redeeming quality or capacity, which, in Thaman's case, came down to his widely acknowledged prowess in training bird dogs. It wasn't enough that, as a barber by trade, poor Thaman was constantly beset by the temptations of Lucky Tiger hair tonic. He was further burdened by an injury incurred in what we called a shooting scrape, which had left him missing a chunk of one heel, whose absence necessitated a special built-up shoe. Unfortunately, when he was perched unsteadily on the trailing edge of sobriety, which is to say much of the time, Thaman often spurned his prosthetic footwear, meaning that his already shaky sense of balance was further compromised, leading to mid-haircut stumbles and lurches, whose effects were registered in the tendency of his long-suffering patrons to pull their hats down as low as possible immediately upon exiting his shop. When I survey the hairstyles favored by so many young men on this campus and throughout the millennial generation, I can't help but think that, bless his heart, poor Thaman might have been able to claim top dollar today for one of his trademark tipsy trims. Since no authentically Southern story may ever proceed to its conclusion in direct linear manner, let me introduce you at this point to my mother, Modena Cobb, who was hands down the greatest person I have known and the single greatest influence on my life. She was a tiny woman, but her love and hopes for me were boundless and overpowering, and her sacrifices in my behalf too numerous and heart-wringing for me to recite. That said, she was in all respects a person of exacting standards and not easily impressed, especially by those who seemed impressed with themselves. While I knew she was very pleased that I seemed to have some facility with words, I also knew that, being as gifted as a carpenter as she was as a seamstress, and having spent so much of her life on a farm, she reserved her greatest personal admiration for those who could build things, repair things, or make things grow. Thinking that I might finally wring a compliment from her in the latter category, at least, in my mid-20s or so, I proudly showed her the succulent squash, green beans, and tomatoes from what was surely the best vegetable patch I'd ever planted. She readily agreed that all the vegetables certainly looked fine. But when I ventured that I thought I might have the makings of a pretty good gardener, her only reply was, "Jimmy, Thaman Hicks could garden." Although her formal education ended with high school, my mother was a voracious reader, and she encouraged me, as an only child living out in the country, to take full advantage of Miss Lizzie Blackwell's summer reading program for kids. She was also inordinately fond of poetry, and I still have her tattered volume of America's Best-Loved Poems. Suffice it to say, many entries in this collection would not fare well under critical scrutiny today. I'm doubly apologetic about sharing even one of them in the company of the two acclaimed poets who will be honored here today. But by way of a single painful example, one of her favorites was the relentlessly upbeat and didactic rhymesmith Edgar A. Guest, who perfectly captured the energy and resolves that so thoroughly defined my mother's character with lines such as, "Someone said that it couldn't be done, but he with a chuckle replied that maybe it couldn't, but he would be one who wouldn't say so till he had tried." This brief snippet should be all you need to understand why Mr. Guest was the only poet ever quoted by Edith Bunker on All in the Family. And why literary mean girl Dorothy Parker once famously declared, "I'd rather flunk my syphilis test than read a poem by Edgar Allan." My mother may have actually exposed me to better verse through her enormous command of the scriptures. A Sunday school teacher for more than 50 years, she was not only a walking compendium of biblical content, but she understood the context of each and every verse. Many's the time I saw religious zealots show up at her door to bombard her with verses that purportedly showed the imminence of Christ's return or the precise number of souls who would get to rock around heaven all day, only to see them beat a speedy, sputtering retreat, their once rock-solid scriptural certainty now in rubble. Along the way, I picked up on how little it meant to speak with the tongues of men and angels without love in your heart, and I learned the lessons of Ecclesiastes long before they became standard recitation fare at weddings and funerals, or provided the lyrics for a hit song by the Byrds. I'm amused today by the extent to which what a few critics have assailed as my bleeding heart liberalism is actually rooted in my childhood baptism in Bible verses. I was blessed to find at Nancy Hart Elementary School a succession of teachers who in that bygone day stressed the fundamentals of correct grammar from the outset and made it a point to drill us in sentence construction, the latter through dogged insistence on sentence diagramming. Here, I think of the beloved Ms. Marjorie Ammons, still very much alive and kicking at 97. who taught 7th grade English not only to me, but to a truly distinguished and deserving member of this group, my friend and fellow Hart County, Terry Kay, who to my knowledge has never to this day been charged with so much as splicing a comma, much less dangling a partisan. When I moved on to Hart County High School, I was entering an institution that, despite its rural location and constituency, stood in the front rank statewide of achievement in scholastic arts and letters. Our debate teams regularly kicked butt in state and regional tournaments, as did our intrepid thespians in the one-act play competitions. All in all, this was an environment where it was not only all right, but maybe even just a little bit cool to care about knowledge and ideas. What sticks with me more than anything from my high school literature classes was a worshipful regard for the sanctity of the texts themselves that a generation later would surely have driven any self-respecting deconstructionist absolutely bonkers. We were frequently required to commit passages from our assigned readings to memory. Over the many years since all this memorizing transpired, I've been amazed at the number of times these passages have come back to me. Ill fares the land to hastening ills of prey, where wealth accumulates and men decay, might read like a line lifted from a contemporary editorial page. But it originates in Oliver Goldsmith's 1770 poem, The Deserted Village, which amounts to a lament for the depopulation of the English countryside by the early stirrings of the Industrial Revolution. Though Goldsmith offers a thoroughly romanticized portrait of rural life, I was struck years later by the intensity of his feelings for a bold peasantry, their country's pride, which once destroyed can never be supplied. I realize now how much his sentiments call to mind my own empathetic written reflections on the men and women of my youth who, like my daddy, were finally required to forsake the relatively unconstrained individualism of the farm for the regimen and anonymity of the factory. My father was already in his mid-50s when he was forced to make this move, and though his $90 weekly paycheck more than doubled our family's income, his palpable dread of heading off to the plant each morning made me understand even then that our improved circumstances came in no small measure at the expense of his dignity and self-regard. As a high school senior, I was captivated by the edgy symbolism of Edna St. Vincent Millay's candle burning at both ends with brilliant but doomed intensity. But I found more staying power in her earlier poem, Renaissance, in which the narrator comes to see that the true fullness of life awaits only those who hang around and summon the will to push back against its limitations, realizing that the world stands out on either side, no wider than the heart is wide. Above the world is stretched the sky, no higher than the soul is high. The heart can push the sea and land farther away on either hand. The soul can split the sky in two and let the face of God shine through. But east and west can pinch the heart that cannot keep them pushed apart. And he whose soul is flat, the sky, will cave in on him by and by. I was well into my 30s before I gained an informed appreciation of William Faulkner, but Thomas Wolfe was a taste acquired much earlier by a high schooler overwhelmed by Wolfe's capacity to meld words into sentences of almost terrifying gravity and force, such as, "The seed of our destruction will blossom in the desert, the election of our cure grows by a mountain rock, and our lives are haunted by a Georgia slattern because a London cutpurse went unhung. Each moment is the fruit of 40,000 years, and every moment is a window on all time." In time, I understood that here and elsewhere, Wolfe, like Faulkner, had captured not only the ultimate futility of trying to separate past and present, but the importance to historians and novelists alike of accepting and exploring their oneness. I realized that as a product of a racially and intellectually segregated educational system, my early literary exposure was limited almost exclusively to the writings of dead white people, some of which might not have passed for great literature even then. Yet, whatever might be said today about the limitations of what I had read by the time I entered the University of Georgia in 1965. For me, the key to understanding what has happened since is that I was taught at home and in school to respect and embrace the power and possibilities of the written word. Beyond that, as someone who wound up writing a lot of words about the South, I could hardly have asked to grow up in a more propitious time or place. In addition to an acute sensitivity to the passing of the rural agrarian society that had defined Southern life for 3 centuries, my experience yielded a bulging archive of vividly remembered flesh and blood manifestations of the injustices and critical intricacies of the dying Jim Crow system in which I had spent my first 18 years. Although my wonderful peer group, so well represented here today, never seemed too hung up on who had what or how much, it would have been nice for me to have formed a little earlier acquaintance with indoor plumbing, or ridden in a family car less likely to trigger a teenager's prayer for instant invisibility, or simply to have had a little more walking around money. When I look back on this formative phase of my life, however, I am not the least bit inclined to think of a disadvantaged youth, but one which afforded me not only unqualified acceptance, but the vital guidance and encouragement that allowed me to spend more than 40 years doing something more immensely satisfying than anything else I could possibly imagine. If anything, given the enormous benefits I've enjoyed from my early formal and informal education in life and letters, I probably should have done a lot better than I have. That I somehow did well enough in the generous estimate of the judges to receive this magnificent affirmation is more than anything a tribute to the love and support of others, especially Lyra McMichael Cobb, without whom most of the accomplishments for which I have been credited would not have been possible, and also without whom none of them would have mattered to me in any event. Today marks one of those highly unlikely outcomes my mother was referring to when she used to say, "If that happens, the band will play Who'd Have Thought It." Before the guys start tuning up, let me simply offer my wholly inadequate but truly heartfelt thanks to everyone who made possible this occasion, which hopefully establishes at long last that there was, after all, at least one thing I could do better than Thaman Hicks. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jim. Joining us today to induct Alfred Korn is the previously introduced Dr. Hugh Rupersberg. And Hugh, I want to extend a special thanks to you for moderating last night's authors panel, which I thought was outstanding and very engaging. I'm sure all those of you who were able to participate in that would agree. So welcome to the podium, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello. I'm pleased to be here today to be able to introduce to you Alfred Korn. Mr. Korn is a distinguished poet and novelist, a critic of art, literature, and music, and commentator on contemporary affairs. He is a native of Bainbridge, Georgia, where he was born in 1943. He grew up in Valdosta and earned his undergraduate degree in French literature from Emory University in 1965. He earned his MA in French literature from Columbia University in 1967. He also taught in the graduate writing program of Columbia University School of the Arts for 18 years. He has held numerous appointments at places such as Yale, Sarah Lawrence, Oklahoma State University, Columbia, Connecticut College, the University of Cincinnati, UCLA, and others. In 2013, he was made a Life Fellow of Clare Hall in Cambridge. In November 2015, he was speaker at the opening of a new museum in Wuzhen, China, dedicated to the life and work of the painter and writer Mu Zin. In April earlier this year, Rocinante, a translated selection of his works, was published in Spain. His first book of poems, All Roads at Once, was published in 1976. The poet John Ashbery wrote that the poems in this beautiful first volume are meditations on time in a contemporary urban setting. Alfred Korn tracks the elusive present through the forest of particulars of daily life. The poet James Merrill praised this book as well. Of his second book, A Call in the Midst of the Crowd, published in 1977, the literary critic Harold Bloom wrote that the title poem is an extraordinary and quite inevitable extension of the New York tradition of major visionary poems, which goes from Poe's City in the Sea and Whitman's Crossing Brooklyn Ferry to Hart Crane's The Bridge and Ashbery's Self-Portrait in a Convex Mirror. Korn, Bloom goes on, achieves an authority and resonance wholly worthy of his precursors. I know of nothing else of such ambition and realized power in Korn's own generation of American poets. In a Boston Review commentary on Korn's mid-career collection, The Present, 1996, Thomas Dish wrote, Korn's poetry is more than the sum of his rare gifts, for underpinning these is a poetic persona as distinctively affable, though less raffish, as those of Merrill or James Schuyler, or, when he's in flaneur mode, Frank O'Hara. It is not the regnant mode among poetry academics at the moment, but since at least the time of Byron and Wordsworth, it has been the kind of poetry that most commends itself to readers of poetry. And finally, Ernest Smith, in the New Georgia Encyclopedia, writes that Korn's book, Notes from a Child of Paradise, while structurally modeled on Dante's Divine Comedy, is an autobiographical piece that stands as the only long poem in American literature to record a history of the intellectual life and the counterculture in the United States during the turbulent 1960s. Carolyn Forsyth, also a poet, all of these people are poets, says, Korn's formal range is everywhere apparent, as he understands art to be always more than technical virtuosity. His poetry never merely displays his considerable poetic skills, but rather becomes a mode of thought, an inquiry into art and passion, the limits of mastery, mortality, divinity, and the possible destiny of the human soul. In all, Korn has published 12 poetry collections, 2 novels, a book on prosody, 2 collections of literary criticism, a study of differences between British and American English, and a work of art criticism. He has translated Proust, Dante, Aristophanes, Sappho, Rilke, Neruda, and others. His poetry, fiction, and criticism of art, literature, and music, and theater has been published in places large and small over the past half century. Examples of where he's been published are the New York Times Book Review, The Nation, the Washington Post Book World, the New Republic, Art in America, and Art News. His awards include the Levinson Prize from Poetry Magazine, an award in literature from the Academy and Institute of Arts and Letters in 1983, and a fellowship in the Academy of Arts and Letters, a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Rockefeller Study and Conference Center at Bellagio appointment, and the Amy Clampett Residency in 2004. His work is frequently anthologized. Some describe Korn's poetic style as formalist, meaning that it uses traditional forms of poetry. But the term doesn't seem quite right. Corn himself doesn't care for the label, pointing out that only about 40% of his poems use meter and only 10% are in rhyme stanzas. Some might regard traditional forms as restraining, but where Corn uses them, they don't seem so at all. One often feels that his poems are conversations, journal entries, travelogues, commentaries on art or history, autobiographical meditations, accounts of walks in city and country, lyric observations of the natural world. Sometimes they reflect on his life and on people he has known. At others, they comment on history and culture in a broad and eclectic way. Two poems in particular of his that I've enjoyed come from his 2002 collection, Contradictions. One is entitled, "And Then I Saw," which is a bemused meditation on what he imagines might happen to his body after his death as friends and acquaintances carry off different parts of himself. Another poem, "Seeing All the Vermeers," recounts his efforts to see as many of the Dutch master's paintings as he can manage, while at the same time connecting those paintings to thoughts about various parts of his life. He has written poems on penguins, people who have burned to death, the World Trade Center attacks, the history of New York, on figures from classical history, on composers and artists and other writers. In much of his work, Georgia may be in the distant background, sometimes closer, sometimes not, but it does occasionally come forward. In the first section of his collection, The Present, he offers narrative and poetic insights into his life as a child in Valdosta. He has written moving poems about his mother and his stepmother. His story, Country Hosts, tells in self-deprecating fashion about a boy's unsuccessful summer vacation on a cousin's farm in South Georgia. Early in his career, he carried on a correspondence with Flannery O'Connor. And I should add, though this may not count for recognition by the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame, that he is the most learned and high-minded poster of comments on Facebook that I have. Few American writers of the past 50 years have written as broadly in such a wide variety of forms and styles on such an array of topics as Alfred Corn. I am pleased to introduce him now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hugh. Hugh and I have been in touch since his work on the New Georgia Encyclopedia, and I've come to greatly admire him, his scholarship, and his personal qualities as well. Unfortunately, no one informed me in advance that we were to give a few words upon acceptance, so I didn't really prepare anything, and actually I'm glad I didn't, because nothing I could have prepared in advance would rival what James Cobb gave us. So it'll just have to be a few off-the-cuff remarks. But I certainly had planned to thank people for this occasion, beginning with University of Georgia and the Russell Library for hosting it. Also, the Board of Judges for the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame for 2017. And I wanted to thank Toby Graham, librarian here, for the really fascinating assemblies of works of the inductees this year that he assembled, and for his participation today. I wanted to thank Leandra Nessel and Skip Hewlett for handling administrative details, which always have to be taken care of. And a new friend, Peggy Gallus, who served as my host here and took me about and showed me the beauties of your city. And certainly to Hugh for his participation. Since I was informed of this, I've been in touch with Stephen Corey of the Georgia Review, and I want to thank him for that and for attending. And I want to say that it's a pleasure and an honor to be inducted this year with the other new Hall of Fame members, James Cobb, Kevin Young, and posthumously Eugenia Price, whom I haven't read, but she was a favorite of my mother's. And I want to finally thank my sisters, Zoe and Margaret, and their husbands, Willie and Ray, for driving about 6 hours to come and attend the event. It was very kind of them. I felt very pleased that they could do that. And otherwise, about myself and this occasion, I was talking to my sister Margaret this morning, and she said, well, don't you remember when you were a kid, like 7 or 8, you used to go out in the neighborhood and meet the other kids and you'd tell them stories? And I did remember that I would do that. And what I would do is sort of concoct invented stories from things I'd been reading and mix and match them with other things and give a 15 or 20-minute story, and that pleased them. In fact, it got to be a little bit of a nuisance because whenever I would go outside, the kids would run up, oh, tell us a story, tell us a story. So I think the instinct to narrate was instilled in me very early. And much of my poetry is narrative, and much of it is a narrative of my own story. And I conceive of poetry in one way or another as recounting your own story, your own nature. The poet Wallace Stevens once wrote, man, nowadays we'd say man and woman, is the intelligence of his soil. And I think there's a good bit of South Georgia sandy loam and North Georgia red clay in my composition. But I also tried to add the intelligence part and to learn as much as I could with the very fine education I got here in public schools and then when I was an undergrad at Emory, and to depart from the conventional profile of someone of my place and time when an intelligent perspective required me to do that. I'm very grateful to be here. And one thing I was taught as a Southern boy was always to be polite and not to trespass on people's attention and not to speak too much of yourself. So I'll let that do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Alfred. It's a pleasure to induct you into the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame. It is my pleasure now to invite to the podium Renee Perriman, who will help us to induct posthumously Eugenia Price. Renee is Director of Marketing at Middle Georgia State University. She's a researcher on Eugenia Price, having done her master's thesis on Price, having authored the New Georgia Encyclopedia article on Eugenia Price. And so we welcome you now to help us to induct Eugenia Price today. Thank you.
Good morning. The invitation to talk about Eugenia Price today is such an honor. She's been part of my life since 1970, when on a family trip to St. Simon's Island, my great Aunt Jo. Better? My Aunt Jo handed me a well-worn copy of The Beloved Invader, the first novel in Miss Price's St. Simon's trilogy. More than a decade later, during my journalism years, I had the opportunity to interview Miss Price several times, in fact, during her many book tours. Fast forward another 20 years, and yet you're doing the math, you can figure out my age. I found myself writing a thesis on Miss Price and her St. Simon's trilogy. So from my interviews, my research, and the hours I spent with Joyce Blackburn, Miss Price's dearest friend and fellow writer, here's what I know about Eugenia Price. Her 58-year career included 2 decades working in radio broadcasting, followed by a successful turn as an inspirational writer and speaker, and then more than 30 years as a best-selling novelist. At the time of her death in 1996, Miss Price had written 14 novels, 22 inspirational books, and 2 autobiographies. Most of her fiction made the New York Times bestsellers list, including The Waiting Time, written after her death. In his 1996 tribute to the writer, New York Times book critic Robert Thomas Jr. wrote, "How many acclaimed authors sell more than 40 million books in 18 languages? That Miss Price did just that was a tribute both to her ability as a storyteller and her knack for recreating a bygone era with such compelling and authentic historic detail. Eugenia Price was born June 22, 1916 in West Virginia, the first child of Anna and Walter Wesley Price. Miss Price said it was her mother who nurtured her growing passions for writing, music, and history, and always telling her she was a born storyteller. In 1932, 16-year-old Eugenia Price enrolled at Ohio University in Athens. Over the next few years, she changed her major 3 times, going from English to dentistry to philosophy. And then she changed college 3 times. And after all that, she never did earn a college degree. But no worries, when she was 23, she was hired by NBC to write daytime serials for radio. Later, she worked for Procter & Gamble in Cincinnati, again writing serials, and at the age of 29, she started her own company, Eugenia Price Productions. By the late 1940s, Miss Price was well known in the radio broadcast business. Her popularity was growing in the Midwest due to her highly rated radio program, Unshackled. As host, she shared the stories of people whose lives were transformed by Jesus Christ, much as her own. Soon she was receiving invitations to speak at church and civic meetings, leading to her next career as an inspirational writer and author. In 1962, Miss Price had written 11 nonfiction books and traveled to nearly every state in the U.S., speaking to standing room only audiences. But let's step back 1 year to the day after Thanksgiving in 1961. As the story goes, Miss Price and Miss Blackburn were en route from a holiday visit in West Virginia to book signing receptions in Florida, where Miss Price was promoting her latest nonfiction, Beloved World. They decided to turn the trip into a vacation and take the scenic coastal highway. Near Charleston, South Carolina, they stopped for lunch and looked at a AAA map to determine their next destination. Miss Blackburn spotted St. Simon's Island and looked in a guidebook to see if it was worth their while to make the trip there. The guidebook mentioned that in 1884, Anson Green Phelps Dodge, Jr. rebuilt Christchurch, Frederica in memory of his wife, Ellen, who died on their honeymoon. The passage about the Reverend Dodge struck a chord with Miss Price. I always wanted to try my hand at historical novel, not necessarily a well-known period in history, she said. I had an idea that if I could find a man or a woman with universal appeal, I could research their background. The writers made their way to St. Simon's, and the next morning, they began exploring the island. Driving north on Frederica Road, we first came to Christchurch, Miss Price said in her memoir. And by noon of that glorious day, I had decided to write a novel about a builder, another Yankee who had fallen under the island's spell, and thus was born the Beloved Invader. For 3 years, Miss Price, with Miss Blackburn's assistance, researched the lives of Reverend Dodge, his first wife Ellen, and his second wife Anna Gould Dodge. Their research took them from the Georgia Historical Society's archives in Savannah to public libraries in coastal Georgia and Chicago, where they were living at the time. They spent hundreds of hours interviewing the descendants of the Dodge and Gould families, as well as other longtime St. Simon's residents. Research for my earliest St. Simon's stories came out of the brains of the oldest people I could meet and out of the people's dresser drawers, said Miss Price. She used available sources. She maintained her chronology of key events during the period of her novel's setting, and she immersed herself in details of the Old South, researching everything from the regional dialects and daily routines of the island planters to their religious convictions and political views. Once the digging is done, Miss Price said, I must then learn all the facts so well that when you read, you believe that you and I are both there in that time and in that place. What was to be one book turned into 3, all published between 1965 and 1971. First, The Beloved Invader. Next came New Moon Rising, which focuses on the life of Horace Bunch Gould and his struggle with slavery. Next, The Lighthouse, the story of New Englander James Gould, who constructed the first St. Simon's Lighthouse. The trilogy, written in reverse chronological order, followed one family from 1787 to 1927. With her first fiction, Miss Price defined herself as a historical novelist who devoted months, sometimes years, to researching her subjects in the era in which they lived. Renewed interest in the history of the Golden Isles of Georgia, spurred by the St. Simon stories, resulted in the founding of the Coastal Georgia Historical Society in 1967. And there was more to come. Miss Price also wrote the Florida Trilogy, the Savannah Quartet, the Georgia Trilogy, and The Waiting Time, published in 1997. Again, real people populated her novel. While each book featured romance and adventure, and often the theme of redemption, Miss Price, as was always her intention, centered her stories around the harsh realities of the time: slavery, secession, war, and families fractured by politics, convictions, and loyalties. In 1965, Miss Price and Miss Blackburn moved permanently from their Chicago home to St. Simons. During her 31 years on the island, Miss Price demonstrated a steadfast commitment to her community. She fought to ensure that the island's marshes, beaches, and indigenous flora and wildlife would not be harmed by advancing industry and a growing coastal population. She supported both vocally and financially St. Simon's historic sites, including the Lighthouse Museum, the Fort Frederica National Monument, and of course the Coastal Georgia Historical Society. In 1989, her financial contribution helped launch the first Georgia Sea Island Festival. Her philanthropy also extended to coastal Georgia libraries and small churches, college students and fledgling writers, Georgia Public Television, and the Carter Center in Atlanta. She and Miss Blackburn established the Eugenia Price Joyce Blackburn Foundation, a nonprofit whose proceeds have funded grants and scholarships, supported charitable organizations, and created programs that promote excellence in writing, such as annual competitions in playwriting and poetry for Glenn County middle and high school students. In 2001, the Georgia Center for the Book, which promotes and celebrates Georgia literature, composed a list of 25 books every Georgian should read. Miss Price's Lighthouse, the final installment in the St. Simon's trilogy, is on that list. Today, Miss Price is as much a part of St. Simon's history as the Gould family, Christ Church, and the Island Lighthouse. When she died of congestive heart failure on May 28, 1996, she left behind a threefold legacy. She preserved the history of coastal Georgia through her novels. She fought to preserve the island's natural beauty through her activism, and she continues to preserve the art of writing through her perpetual generosity. I believe Miss Price will be proud and humbled that she is being inducted into the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame. On behalf of her devoted readers everywhere, thank you for recognizing first her love of the South and next her contribution to preserving our state's history through her writing. To me and to many others, West Virginia-born Eugenia Price will always be Georgia's true beloved invader. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Renee. And so accepting the induction on behalf of Eugenia Price is Eileen Humflett. Eileen is director of the Eugenia Price Joyce Blackburn Charitable Foundation, and I believe you worked with Ms. Price for over a dozen years, right? So thank you so much for being with us.
Did I get this right? Is that better? Toby told me I had to do it just right. Real close like this. Okay. Okay. Very good. Thank you so much. Since I don't think you can ever be thanked too much, I too would like to thank the Board of Judges for the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame, the Harvard Rare Book and Manuscript Library, and the University of Georgia Librarian, Toby Graham, for choosing to honor Eugenia Price in this way. And Renee, as always, you portray Jeannie in both a scholarly and loving way. Thank you so much. I would also like to acknowledge and thank Leandra Nessel for her expert coordination of this event. And a special thank you to our new friends and gracious host, Glenda and Jimbo Laboon. And they were gracious even after they found out we were Georgia Tech fans. I know that Jeannie has many friends, relatives, and readers who love her and appreciate that she is being honored with this award. And joining us here today to celebrate our special guest, Cindy Birdsong, Jeannie's niece, Mary Ray Wheeler, who is the Vice President of the Eugenia Price Joyce Blackburn Foundation, and also the author of Eugenia Price's South, and Mimi Rogers. Mimi is the curator of the Coastal Georgia Historical Society and administrator of the Eugenia Price exhibit at the Lighthouse Museum. But I have to tell you, the person who is appreciating and enjoying this the most today is Jeannie Price. And I know that from their lofty perch in heaven, she and her best friend, Joyce Blackburn, along with many other friends and former inductees, are also celebrating with us. Ironically, Jeannie was never sure that she would ever be considered a Georgia writer. She knew she could tell a good story. She went to great lengths to make sure her stories were historically accurate, often utilizing the resources of libraries from Glenn County to the Library of Congress. And of course, she always had legions of devoted fans. But I can tell you that from the moment she set foot on St. Simon's Island and discovered the story of Anson and Ellen Dodge in Christ Churchyard, her life was forever changed. She was so drawn to the Georgia coast that she left her home, Little Toot, in Chicago, and never looked back. She left her beloved Cubbies and became a devoted Atlanta Braves fan. She and Joyce even followed the Braves to training camp for many years. And game time always brought out the hats, t-shirts, and tomahawks so that they could cheer in style wherever they were. Jeannie and Joyce were loyal members of Jimmy Carter's Peanut Brigade. Jeannie had always been a Democrat, but her lifelong friendship with President and Mrs. Carter ensured that she would forever share his politics. And as Renee said, Jeannie was committed to her adopted home. She became a founding member of the Coastal Georgia Historical Society. She worked tirelessly with Representative Reed Harris of Glenn County to pass the Coastal Marshlands Protection Act. Nobody was going to mess with Georgia's beautiful marshes if she had anything to do with it. Eugenia Price was perhaps the most disciplined person I have ever met, and she was happiest when she was behind the gate of the Dodge, her home on St. Simon's Island, sitting in front of her manual typewriter, cranking out yellow pages of manuscript. In fact, she was often so focused on her stories that she would misdate a piece of correspondence. And I don't mean just the day or the month. She would get the century wrong. And even though she preferred being at home, Jeannie always loved going out to dinner at Alphonse's Old Plantation Supper Club and eating a steak or a lamb chop and collard greens. But she was just as happy sitting at home in her easy chair, barefooted, eating a Spam sandwich and watching the Atlanta Braves. She loved Spam so much that one Christmas my husband and I gave her a case of it for Christmas. The only Southern thing I can think of that Jeannie really couldn't abide was iced tea, especially sweet tea. And my habit of getting in the car with a to-go cup in my hand was something she tolerated, but she never understood and never tried. If you have read any of Eugenia Price's novels, you know that her characters, both real and imagined, always had a strong sense of place, and so did she. We all know and appreciate what an accomplished writer Eugenia Price was, and how beloved she was and is by her readers. But I wanted you to know that in her heart and soul, her place, forever and always, is the great state of Georgia. And I know that being honored as a Georgia writer makes her very happy. Jeannie, congratulations, we love you. And again, thank you so much for this honor.
It is now time to induct Kevin Young into the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame. And in doing so, we have with us Jericho Brown. Professor Brown directs the creative writing program at Emory University. His poems are widely and prominently published in venues like the New Yorker and, most importantly for us, the Georgia Review. His two books, Please and the New Testament, have been celebrated through multiple prizes and excellent reviews. He's the recipient of the Whiting Writers Award. Let's welcome Jericho Brown to the podium. Thank you so much.
Hi. Thank you so much for having me here and giving me the opportunity to sing the praises of one of my colleagues, a man who is also, in many ways, one of my literary forebears. The trouble is that my assignment for the day came with an Achilles heel. I am not only to introduce Kevin Young, I am to introduce him in no more than 5 minutes. Of course, this is exactly what Kevin Young's career makes it hard for anyone to do. Putting a time limit on presenting him requires pinning down a literary figure whose every move, whose every book, proves that our ideas about someone can never be as complex as that person really is. And for Kevin in particular, it has been of utmost importance to show in his work and through his life that our ideas about Black people can never be as complex as Black people always have been. A winner of the PEN Open Book Award, a Guggenheim Fellow, the author of 10 poetry collections and 2 books of cultural criticism, and the poetry editor of The New Yorker, Kevin Young will, this Wednesday, turn 47 years old. All of that before the age of 47, but I'm supposed to introduce him in 5 minutes. Good luck, Jericho Brown. Doctors Paul and Azzy Young grew up in segregated rural Louisiana and were the first in their families to attend and graduate from college. An eye surgeon and a chemist, they moved their family around every few years while pursuing their careers. Their son, Kevin Lowell Young, attended high school in Topeka, Kansas, the same city where Gwendolyn Brooks was born, the same city where a first grader named Langston Hughes became one of the first to integrate a local elementary school. Young did his undergraduate work at Harvard, where he was a student of Nobel laureate Seamus Haney, and where he became a member of the Darkroom Collective. After graduating from Harvard, he held a Stegner Fellowship at Stanford and then went on to get his MFA from Brown. I want to point out here that this is the wrong order. Usually you go get an MFA and then you might be lucky enough to get a Stegner. But Kevin has always been a prodigy. He was a beloved poetry professor at the University of Georgia here and at Indiana University before moving to Emory University, where he joined a faculty that had the sense to hire me, where he remained for 12 years and served as curator of the Raymond Danowski Poetry Library, a 75,000 volume collection of contemporary and centuries-old work. He also served as curator of the library's literary collections, which contains the work the archival work of Seamus Haney, Lucille Clifton, Alice Walker, Jack Kerouac, and Flannery O'Connor. He has edited widely read poetry anthologies on food, on jazz, and on grief, as well as a book of the poetry of John Berryman. As the new director of the Schomburg Center, which is the leading research center for Black culture in the country, he has already seen the library be named a National Historic Landmark, and he has completed the plan to acquire James Baldwin's papers, and already has made Baldwin's letters available to the public. So much for 5 minutes. I think it's safe to say that Kevin Young's accomplishments have put him in a position where any scholar studying American poetry 150 years from now will have to reckon with the contribution our honoree makes to canons that seem disparate and divergent until we look closely at his work. Yes, Kevin plays several roles and serves many communities, but any way you look at it, he is first a poet. The major challenge Kevin Young continues to make for himself in his own poems is to combine the intensity of lyric with the scale of epic. His work expands on the work of one of his own teachers, the poet Denise Levertov, who insisted on organic form, likening line and line break to musical score. His attention to the music of poetry solidifies his position as a poet who not only masters one, but can also have a range of tones and voices in his work, even in one poem. Each of his poems places us in a single moment when the full range of the human experience can be felt. An example of this is in the poem Limelight Blues, which closes, "When I dance, which is often, the moon above me wheels its disco lights until there's a fight. Crowds gather and wonder how the spotlight sounds, like a body being born, like the blare of car horns as I cross the street unlocking slow. I know all the movie needs is me, shouting at the screen from the balcony. From such heights I watch the darkness gather. What pressure my blood is under." The poem, as Robert Lowell says, isn't just the record of an experience, but an experience unto itself. And the poems I continue to teach over the years by Kevin Young do what Lucille Clifton said poetry must do: comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. It is no wonder that she selected his first book of poetry for publication through the National Poetry Series, starting a literary career bent on work that afflicts and comforts. Or, as John Berryman says in the Dream Songs, his poems are meant to terrify and comfort. Kevin Young knows that a good poem does both. Often historical and necessarily personal, his poetry evokes, reminds, and agitates. But poems aren't public service announcements. Young's book, To Repel Ghosts, wasn't written so more people know about Basquiat. His book, The Ardency, wasn't written so more people know about the Amistad Rebellion. These books were written because, as all good books do, they make way for us to find out more about ourselves. Young commits himself to his subjects for himself, for a more full discovery of himself. His literary obsessions are the way for him to learn more about history and about pop culture. Kevin's own scholarly and archival interests in pop culture don't just make him cool or hip. He may be cool and hip, but only as much as these lend to him being a foremost public intellectual. Kevin and I have students in common, so I know what he teaches isn't only poetry, but how to read in the broadest, deepest sense. It's that reading of culture, of history, not just of words, that he means to champion beyond the university. Kevin Young's new book of cultural criticism, just out now, is titled Bunk: The Rise of Hoaxes, Humbug, plagiarists, phonies, post-facts, and fake news. I just like saying that title, so I'm gonna say it again. Bump, the rise of hoaxes, humbug, plagiarists, phonies, post-facts, and fake news. The book traces the history of hoax and deceit in American cultural and political life, moving from P.T. Barnum in the late 19th century to Melania Trump's plagiarism of Michelle Obama's Democratic National Convention speech. I talked with Kevin while he was doing research for the book, and this was long before our last presidential election. Already, Young was outlining the long and insidious history of our nation, outlining the long and insidious history our nation has of revising the past to make certain peoples invisible. Already, he was writing to understand and to correct a society in which facts become secondary. So as you see, I couldn't introduce such a phenomenon in only 5 minutes, but I can let him do the talking for himself. So without further ado, the prodigy, the poet, the public intellectual, and now the prophet, Kevin Young.
I'm just hoping that Jericho Brown can introduce me always. I'm getting a pin that says prophet. No, really, Jericho, thank you so much. It's really been an honor working with you at Emory, and I met Jericho before he had a book, but he always had a book, if you know what I mean. He was always that brilliant, so thank you. I want to thank you all for this honor. I want to thank the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame and the Board of Judges. I really was pleased and surprised and to be recognized in such a way. I want to thank Leanne for her administrative acumen. I want to thank Toby Graham too. I worked in libraries, as Jericho said, for 12 years and now run one. And they really are sacred spaces to me. And to be here and talking about history and to play some small part in it is really an honor to me. I first came to Georgia and to University of Georgia 22 years ago, and I left for a little spell there to Indiana, but really I was here 17 years, and as Jericho mentioned, I moved around a lot as a kid. I moved 6 times before I was 10. And so the 17 years I spent here in Georgia was really the longest I've ever lived anywhere by a country mile. I want to thank a few people who I saw in the audience. I'm sure there's others I know and care for, but it's a real pleasure to see Barbara McCaskill out there. She was really good to me when I first got here, and I haven't seen her in a long time, so good to see you. Also to have 2 of my former students here who they weren't exactly, to say students is to say a different way of saying they became my friends, Jeff Fallis and Sean Hill, who've gone on to do great things both at Georgia and beyond. So thank you for coming. Jericho mentioned a phrase that I think is going to be my new motto. He said food, jazz, and grief. Maybe it's already my motto, but it also seems to me indicative of something of the Southern culture that my parents both came from and that I was happy to participate in here in Georgia firsthand. I thought rather than talk a long time, by way of thanks, I want to read 2 poems that came from this place. One is a blues poem. When I was here, just living down the road, I wrote most of what became a book called Jelly Roll of Blues. And it was very much a book, a personal book. What I came to love about the blues as a form is it's a form that told personal things, intimate things, but not necessarily autobiographical things. I came to call this sort of the blues correlative, and that you could talk about the train or you could talk about the river, and it was a way of connecting to this long American and African American history. Whether it was the river that you were baptized in, that when I was growing up I saw many a person baptized in, or the river you crossed to become free. It was right there as something you could connect to. likewise the train, and I lived right across the train tracks, and could hear the train at many late an hour. Sometimes coming home from downtown, I couldn't quite cross the tracks, so there'd be a train there late at night. And so I came to know the train, and it came to be both an actual thing and a metaphoric thing. This poem is called Ditty. Ditty. You, rare as Georgia snow, falling hard, quick, candle shadow, the cold spell that catches us by surprise, the too early blooms, tricked, gardenias blown about, circling wind, green figs. Nothing stays. I want to watch you walk the hall to the cold tile bathroom all night, a lifetime. And I thought I'd end with a poem from another book that I wrote the bulk of here in a different time. It was called For the Confederate Dead. And I was very much thinking of Robert Lowell, who my middle name doesn't come from, but who I always used to ask my parents, why is my name Lowell? And they'd say, I don't know. They couldn't answer me. Finally, I pinned my mom down once. She said, it was a judge on TV, I think, or something. So, at the same time, the title poem talks about that, because Robert Lowell, of course, had written For the Union Dead, and his old teacher, Alan Tate, had written an ode to the Confederate dead, and so I found myself, by dint of that TV judge, or just by dint of poetry in this tradition, and trying to write about these monuments in memory. But I thought I'd read a different poem than that title poem, though the title poem is set here in Athens. I thought I would also read this poem from another section in that book, which is called From the Ballad of Jim Crow. And I had written another book called Black Mariah, much of it I wrote here. And it was a film noir in verse, and what I liked about that is it let me have a mob boss or a gun soul, these different characters who got to tell their own story a little bit, or their story told about them. And one was the killer, and he had many names, Dr. Death, Mr. Red, John Doe was another one, and one was Jim Crow. And so after that book, I started thinking about, well, what about if Jim Crow walked around and was a killer, which of course Jim Crow was. And so I wrote this sort of set of ballads about him, and this is the last one where it talks a little bit about his mother, Jim Crow's mother, and also about a friend of his named Rust who's passed away, and his sister named Sleep. It's called Magnificat. Now that he was rich, Jim Crow didn't act like it. Done with sharkskin suits and linen, he learned to patch his clothes and count every coin like a sin. His woolens worn away like a record played too much, the hound's tooth warped like Bessie's broad voice. Each month he sent his mother a bundle, though the two rarely spoke. Enclosed is a little something for food, he wrote. And when Rust went wherever the dead did, Jim sprung for all expenses, ordered the best casket at Bloodworth's funeral home. The dam of his eyes broke, and Jim couldn't go. Each Sunday, Jim's mother gave over her take to God, who didn't ask where the bread came from. Neither did she. Still, every once in a moon, his mother bought herself a church hat with shoes to match, not to hide her face, but frame its blossom brown and remind folks that humility need not be ugly. Beneath her hat, its bright, unfading flowers. Jim's mother lowers her head and prays for her son's soul, for sleep to return, for freedom from this toil and the red, red soil. It's me, Lord, Jim's mama said, bent her hatted head and clenched like teeth her hands. "It's me, Lord," she reminded herself, whose mother named her America, and whose father was born a slave, but died free, which is better than the other way round, if you ask me. I want to thank you again for this honor, and thanks to my parents for helping me get here, so thank you so much. I want my wooden book.
Both Jim's and Alfred's, but we'll get you the right one. But thank you all so much for being here for I think what has been a special moment in the cultural life of our state. Just thank you so much to our inductees and to the introducers. You did such a wonderful job today. A couple of things in closing. First of all, one of the people who I kind of missed coming in on the way in, but I wanted to acknowledge is Karen Patey. Karen, if you could stand up. She's the director of the Georgia Council of the Arts and does such wonderful work in the state. I want to also direct your attention to the exhibit that we have in the Harbert Library Gallery here. Skip Hewlett, who's the head of the Harbert Library's Georgiana collection, curated that on our 2017 inductees. So I hope that you'll take the time to go and enjoy that in the galleries just down the hall. We're pleased that the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame is part of the UGA Arts Council's Spotlight on the Arts, which is about a week and a half of events that runs through November 12th. The full schedule, which includes more than 100 different programs and exhibitions, is available online if you want to go find that at arts.uga.edu. Also want to draw your attention to this very special issue of the Georgia Review, which came out in 2012, and it is focused on the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame and the inductees up to that point. And it is available out here in the hallway. And so just finally, I just want to thank you for coming, and let's have one more round of applause for James C. Cobb, Alfred Korn, Kevin Young, and to the memory of Eugenia Price.